All right. Hello, thank you all for coming to our M room here Thursday. And we have a very special guest joining us today, Dr. Erica Williams. She's the associate professor at the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Spelman College. And we're very honored to have her with us here in person in the M room. And join us as we talk about some of the major challenges facing Black women in Brazil today. So thank you so much. Pleasure to have you. You press this, right? Yes. And then hold it down. And there you go.
Okay, can you hear me? Can everyone hear me? I guess I'll take my mask off since there's not a lot of people in here. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm really excited to be here. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about the work, my kind of research trajectory and the work that I've done in Brazil. So again, like she said, I'm an associate professor of anthropology at Spelman College. I started off as an undergraduate at New York University, double majoring in anthropology and Africana studies. I studied abroad in Brazil when I was a senior, and through that process, I fell in love with Brazil, first of all, and I knew I wanted to just spend more time there. And I also witnessed what I would later study and write a book about, which was sex tourism. So that was my first book, published in 2013, and a result of my dissertation research. After that, once I got to Spelman, I started bringing students to Brazil in the summer to do a study abroad program. And I got into a second research project on Black feminist activism in Bahia. And what I noticed was starting in around 2011, there seemed to be this kind of emergence or resurgence of Black feminist activism in Bahia that was very strong. There was an organization founded called Odara, Institute of the Black Woman. And they were doing a lot of really important work to mobilize, to create a network of Black women throughout the state, in the northeast of Brazil and throughout the whole northeastern region. There was a march of Black women held in Brasilia, in the nation's capital, in 2015 that brought together tens of thousands of Black women of all different generations, different walks of life, to kind of to raise their voices about the situation of Black women in Brazil and the struggles that they're still dealing with. So I would go back, every year as I could. The last time I was there was in 2019, of course, because the pandemic just, threw everything off. But I wanted to, hopefully you all have heard of Marielle Franco, right? Marielle Franco was a Rio de Janeiro-based politician. She was a Black woman from the favelas, which is a poor, marginalized neighborhood in throughout Brazil. And she was assassinated in March, actually this month, a few years ago. Oh, I didn't, is it 2018? I forgot the year, but I think it was like 2018. And she was leaving an event called the Young Black Women Moving Structures at the Casa das Pretas, which means House of Black Women. She was 38 years old. She was a Black queer woman who was a single mom at 19. She had studied sociology and public administration, and she was the only Black woman on Rio de Janeiro City Council at the time of her murder. She had overcome so many obstacles in her life to be able to reach this influential leadership position in Rio de Janeiro politics. And just days before her death, she tweeted about the epidemic of police violence in the favelas, asking, quote, "How many more have to die?" End quote. So some of the activists that I've spoken with over the years in Brazil called the assassination of Marielle Franco a femicidio político, which means political femicide. And this term came up a lot in Brazil, femicidio or feminicidio. And actually, so this basically means the murder of women. And I was reading some statistics about femicidio in Brazil. And there's, let me find. Okay. So they said recent statistics say that Brazil has the 5th highest rate of feminicidio in the world. And this is data from the World World Health Organization, the numbers, I'm translating from Portuguese as I speak, are 4.8 assassinations of women for every 100,000 residents. Black women are 27.8% of the whole population of Brazil, but of these, of this, a large part live in the periphery, and the periphery is the name for kind of favelas or marginalized low-income neighborhoods. They're workers in the informal sector, and a lot are domestic workers, or they're often unemployed. Black women are less than 5% of the, elected representatives, like mayors and councilwomen, who were elected in the elections of 2020. So on the one hand, you have this high rate of being victims of feminicidio, of domestic violence, of different forms of violence, but very low rates of representation in politics, right? 71% of victims of feminicidios are Black women between the ages of 21 and 40 years old. Almost 90% are killed by a companion, a boyfriend, or husband who did not accept the end of the relationship. And a feminicidio against Black women has grown 54% in the last 10 years, or in a 10-year period. And this was data coming from the Map of Violence published in 2015. The number of homicides of Black women in 2003 was 1,864. And in 2013, this number grew to 2,875. While at the same time that this number grew for Black women, the number fell 9.8% for white women in the same time period. So there's, another alarming statistic is that in Brazil, 68% of the women assassinated are Black women. So, and another one is that a woman is assassinated every 2 hours in Brazil. There were 4,519 women assassinated in 2018. So you can see that this is a big problem. And so this question of feminicidio was one that, a lot of the women that I talked to came back to again and again. So actually, in the aftermath of the assassination of Marielle Franco. Oh, and another thing, she was in the car. She had a driver and an assistant in the car. Her driver was also killed. The assistant survived. And so the death of Marielle Franco had a large impact on Brazil, on Black women's organizing and activism. There's a term called sementes de Marielle, which is basically the seeds of Marielle. So a lot of Black women Black activists wanted to seek political office after her assassination. She inspired them, because there was this idea that, okay, even though she was murdered, I must say that they never found out who did it, but the gun was the same kind of gun that the military police and the different kind of state police associations use. So the assumption is that it was related to a state, that it was like a state-sponsored kind of thing. So when I was in Bahia in July of 2019, there were several women, Black women, who were preparing to launch their campaigns for various political offices, including mayor and city councilor. There was also a newly formed entity called the Forum Marielles, or the Marielles Forum. So this idea emerged from a desire to pay homage to Marielle Franco 1 year after her assassination. So organizers invited Black women from various segments of the Black women's movement to convene at the Center for Afro-Oriental Studies, or CEAL, which is a part of the Federal University of Bahia. Ana Claudia Pacheco, who's a Brazilian anthropologist, she suggested that they create the Forum Marielles as a space to mature and amplify discussions about the political representation of Black women. They published this manifesto, this Forum Marielles manifesto, which was really powerful. They opened by saying, "We are descendants of a people who believed in freedom, even though the project seemed to be fiction." And they conclude the manifesto by saying, We are the continuous struggle for freedom, and we consider that our political emancipation will only occur with the overcoming of all forms of oppression. We are the dream and the political project of equality and justice. We are Marielis, aquilombadas in connections with women. Aquilombadas is a Portuguese term that's difficult to translate, and I'll be talking more about it in my public lecture on next Thursday. But it's basically coming from this term quilombo. If anyone's heard of it, it's like the idea of maroon communities during the time of slavery. So, you know, Zumbi dos Palmares is one of the most famous leaders of a quilombo in Brazil, in Alagoas, in the northeast of Brazil. But this term aquilombadas has been taken up by Black activists to kind of say that they use it more symbolically, like to say that we need to unite in a metaphorical quilombo. We need to come together. We need to have each other's backs. We need to, you know, create this safe space and sacred space to gather our strength and our forces to fight against, you know, the injustices and the different things affecting us. So this manifesto is signed with the list of 100 Black women's organizations, entities, and candomblé terreiros. And candomblé is an Afro-Brazilian religion that, and the terreiros are like kind of their churches or their spaces of worship. So when I got back home, I thought I had this part here. Okay, sorry, I'm like calling from a few different things. So when I got back, after that visit in July, in late November 2019, when I was back in Atlanta, I went on social media and I discovered the horrifying news of yet another Black Brazilian woman who had been killed by an intimate partner in an act of what has increasingly been referred to as feminicidio. The Foro Marielis wrote a statement, and I translated it into English and published it on the site Black Women Blog. So this woman's name was Elitania Souza da Hora, and she was a quilombola leader. So she was from Bahia. She was a student at the Federal University of the Recôncavo of Bahia, which is in a town called Cachoeira. It's a more kind of rural town in Bahia. Quilombola is kind of the descendants of these quilombos, like the communities that are, you know, Afro-Brazilian communities trying to preserve heritage and culture and land rights. So she was an activist and a leader. She was about to graduate with her degree in social services. And she was a part of the Academic Center of Social Services, Marielle Franco. She was brutally murdered in broad daylight outside of the university. And so an excerpt from the statement that the Foro Marielis published reads, and I quote, "Like many women in Brazil, Elitania da Hora found herself trapped in an abusive relationship with a man who wouldn't leave her in peace. A victim of domestic violence, she had already reported the case to the police station, and she even had a protective order against the ex. She was a woman with a big smile, always nice and kind, with strong opinions and dreams of a successful professional life," end quote. And the statement goes on to bring up the assassination of Marielle Franco the previous year and the ineffectiveness of the Brazilian justice system in handling that crime. So the statement continues, and I quote, "The high rates of femicide in Brazil are also scary, particularly when we analyze them from a racial dimension. According to data from the Ministry of Health compiled by the Atlas of Violence launched by the Institute of Applied Economic Research and by the Brazilian Forum of Public Security, for example, 4,936 murders of women were registered in 2017. That is an average of 13 homicides per day, the largest number in a decade. According to information from the Map of Violence, in Brazil between 2003 and 2013, the number of femicides of Black women jumped from 1864 in 2003 to 2875 in 2013. And okay, I already mentioned that statistic earlier. So the statement concludes by claiming that femicide remains untouchable for us Black women as a constant threat to the lives of these women and to their well-being. Moreover, it asserts the forum, the Foro Marielis, as a space that brings together a variety of Black Bahian women's organizations to fight against this necropolitics adopted by the Brazilian state that has a tragic impact on the well-being of Black women. And finally, the statement concludes with the bold assertion quote, "We will speak up, denounce, and demand our rights so that all Black women may live their lives without being interrupted. The issue of femicide is just one of many issues that Black Bahian activists in Bahia, Black feminist activists in Bahia are fighting against." So I didn't know how this, was going to be, if there's going to be more like people and interactive questions. So I can stop there and open for questions, or I can talk some more about the particular marches. What do y'all think?
Any questions? You're welcome to continue.
Hey, I do have a question.
Sure.
So you talk us through sort of the problem, right? And I assume maybe you'll get to this, but you talk us through sort of the problem and the incredible amount of murder happening with Black women in Bahia. Can you maybe help walk us through a little bit what is being done from a policy standpoint, and then what are some recommendations and how to address this issue?
Okay, yeah, that's a great question. So from a policy standpoint, it's a very interesting situation in Brazil, because a lot of time they have this expression that, you can have a law or a policy that nunca sai do papel. So that means it never leaves the paper. So sometimes, like, there's the Lei Maria da Penha, which is the law named after a woman, Maria da Penha, who was murdered by her husband. And it was set, I think it's been in place for about 20 years. And it was basically set up to, to give harsher punishments to, to perpetrators of domestic violence, intimate partner violence, and murders against women. But one of the things, 20 years after this law has been implemented, people have found, and especially Black women activists have critiqued it and saying that it's not doing enough, that it's not being implemented properly, that it's not, it's not helping the situation, particularly with Black women. And that, in fact, since this law has been passed, the numbers have continued to increase. So that's one issue. The other thing is there was, I think in 2015, there was another law created that kind of named feminicidio as a category, right? That it's not as a particular, a particular thing. So it's not just murder. It's not just, they just kind of trying to, sometimes there's a power in naming things, right? So to call it what it is, that it's, murders of women, because they are women or because of the characteristics of being women, it has something to do with them being women. So that's a relatively new thing that also is taking a long time to kind of have an impact or to kind of improve the situation. So that's one of the reasons that the activists that I talk to are doing so much work, trying to raise awareness, trying to work directly in communities to they have this conscientização, like to let women know to to try to escape situations like that, or that there's resources for them. In Bahia also, there's a critique that some of the state entities that are supposed to help women, like they have a delegacia, they have police stations specifically for women, but a lot of times those police stations are in majority white middle class neighborhoods, as opposed to the peripheral neighborhoods where a lot of poor Black women live. So there's still these racial disparities and racial inequality. So as much as, on the state or the policy side, Brazil is trying to take steps forward and do things to, to solve these problems, there's still, issues in them actually being implemented and actually having a positive impact. So that's where I feel the Black women activists come in terms of them doing, grassroots work, working with communities, being a reference point. Like, for instance, I talked to some women. There's an organization called Ginga, which is based in the Suburbio Ferroviario. That's basically these in the lower city part of Salvador. There are these neighborhoods that are all along a railroad line, and they're seen as very, very poor neighborhoods, very under-resourced. But this organization has kind of become a reference point for, so whenever women in the neighborhood are experiencing violence, they go to them. Like they try to figure out, okay, what can I do? What are the resources? What do I, so they're like they've kind of filled the role that the state should be playing, right? That the state ideally would be playing. So that's just one example. There's another thing, and I didn't want to, repeat what I'm going to talk about in my lecture on Thursday, but there's in Bahia, the Odara, the very large feminist organization, started this month in July. They call it Julio das Pretas, or July of Black Women. They started this in 2013, and it's basically to raise awareness about July 25th is the International Day of celebration of the Afro-Latin American and Caribbean woman. And so they wanted to have a month of activities, of events, of different things to kind of raise awareness about what's the situation that Black women are facing in Brazil right now. What are some things where they're working on to try to combat these things? And it's a very vibrant and active month that I've attended several times and attended different events. And so through things like that, they also have different kinds of activities in schools and in theaters, and they just have a wide range of things trying to bring these issues to light and to really try to make change from a grassroots level. Does that answer your question?
It does. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I ask you one more question, and then I'll let you have your presentation back? So you mentioned that this femicide was sort of one of the issues that Black activist women have been working on there in Brazil. Can you talk about some of the other issues and how maybe they are affected or integrated with this issue too? How this issue may affect some of the other issues that some of the Black women activists are working on?
Yes, thank you for that. So I'm in the middle of, and actually why this 2-week residency is so nice. Being at a historically Black college, I teach 3 courses a semester. I'm on sabbatical this semester, but I'm working on this book project now. And I'm literally, when I'm not doing class visits or things like this, I'm typing up, going back through my interviews that I've done over the years since 2013, my field notes. So, this is kind of very much, fresh in my mind right now. But there's a range of other issues. So one thing that I noticed was that one major issue too, but it also has to do with violence. I guess violence is a really key issue, but Black feminist activists are really mobilizing around police violence against Black youth. So just like we have here, Black Lives Matter, there they have Para de nos matar, which is stop killing us, right? And there's also been some, like the Black Lives Matter. I was at a meeting, a launch of an English class for Black women activists in 2019 in Brazil, and I was asked to translate and to speak. And Opal Tomedi, who's one of the Black Lives Matter the founders, happened to be in Bahia, and she went, came to the event and spoke to the women. So there is a cross kind of some relationship between those different movements. But yeah, the police violence against Black youth is another big issue that they're dealing with, because that affects women, because a lot of times they're the mothers, right? They're the mothers, they're the aunts. And so they, and there's been studies done that show that after, that a woman who has her child murdered by the police or whatever, she ends up having a heart attack or having major health issues. There's it's called sequelae. There's all these after effects and impacts on the woman, on her family, on the community because of the police violence. And one of the big things is that a lot of times, so especially if you live in a peripheral neighborhood, in the favela or, marginalized neighborhood, there's this assumption of criminality, right? There's this assumption that you're involved in drug trafficking. When most of the people that live in those communities are workers. They're trying to go to work. They're trying to, they're just normal everyday people, and they're not affiliated with drug trafficking. But when the police come in those communities looking for, for drug traffickers, they just start shooting. They just shoot, and then anybody who's around is a victim, right? There's there was a case a few months ago of a 6-year-old boy who was murdered by police, just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Just this week or last week, there was a case in Bahia of in this neighborhood called Gamboa de Baixo, which is close to the center, the World Historic Center of Salvador. But it's kind of this community that's like a fishing, it was a former fishing colony. It's right on the bay. And there's an anthropologist named Keisha Khan Perry who wrote a really wonderful book about activism in that community. Because they've been fighting to retain their land, right? Because there's been efforts to displace them. But there were several youth who were just murdered by police in that community. So this is an ongoing, this is an issue that keeps coming up again and again. There's also an issue of they deal with religious intolerance, because a lot of the women activists, especially in Bahia is a place where about, they say over 75% of the population is of African descent. And there's a very strong preservation of African culture. And so there's this religion called Candomblé. It's an Afro-Brazilian religion that comes from the Yoruba, people of Nigeria. And so they preserve, there's the deities are called orishas. They preserve, the names, the language, there's Yoruba language, Yoruba food, all of this is preserved in Bahia. And so with the growing evangelical movement in Brazil, and it's happening all over Latin America, there's a lot of, churches that are popping up, especially in, low income, marginalized communities, and people who are converting, who are becoming evangelicals. And this creates a very tense relationship, right? Sometimes the evangelicals are actually burning tejeros, burning the candomblé, or yelling at them, you're the devil, or these are things of the devil, or it's like this. Whereas Catholicism has coexisted with candomblé forever, right? And there's syncretism, there's Saints Day festivals, which are also candomblé festivals, right? They're the two things at the same time. But the evangelical movement has this very this kind of relationship of animosity with tejeros. So a lot of the Black feminist activists are also in candomblé, or religious adherents of candomblé. And there's another concept that I talk about in my larger work called ancestralidade, which means loosely translates to ancestrality, but it's basically like this idea that your African heritage, and candomblé is a part of that this is a source of empowerment for Black women activists, right? So even the idea in Brazil, the idea that you choose to identify as Black is seen as a powerful thing, because there's ways that you can try to escape Blackness in Brazil that some people have, because in Brazil they have different names for different color combinations, and depending on your skin color, your hair texture, your features, you can call yourself something else, right? You can be morena, you can be mulata, you can be cafuso, you can be sarará. There's all these different terms, right? So sometimes people try, and there's the myth of racial democracy in Brazil, right? Which argues that in Brazil, the bigger issue is class, not race, that racism isn't really as bad in Brazil as it is in other places. And this has been disproved for decades, but some people still really hold on to it and they want to believe it, right? In Brazil, there's also a larger push for people to identify with their nationality, with being Brazilian, as opposed to being, Black or white or whatever racial identification. So these are things that the Black movement, in general, and then the Black women's movement and Black feminist movement in particular has had to push back against and fight against. So really, identity and having having self-esteem, autoestima, and strongly identifying with being Black are also kind of struggles that people deal with. And so Black feminist activists are also working with youth on that level of just getting them to be comfortable with being Black, right? And with and not succumbing to the different, all the stereotypes and all the negative images that come that society, bombards them with about being Black. Education, access to higher education is another big thing. There's still a situation in Brazil, their version of the SAT is called the vestibular. And in Brazil, public universities are the most prestigious and they're free. And so they're the ones that people are really trying to get into, right? But what happens if you're, poor, Black, from a marginal neighborhood, you go to a public school growing up, you don't get prepared for the vestibular, right? And you don't have the money to pay for a vestibular preparation course, right? Whereas if you're white, middle class, or upper class, you go to the private schools, you get prepared for the vestibular, therefore you get into the free, prestigious public universities that are free. If if you don't have that access, you don't get into those universities. You end up having to go to a private university where you have to pay, and so you have to work and pay, and they don't have this system of student loans and things like we have here. So the Black movement since the 90s has also set up certain pre-vestibular courses for Black youth. Like the most famous one in Bahia is the Instituto Steve Biko, which is named after a South African leader. And so since about the mid 90s, they've done these vestibular courses for Black youth. And they also, not only do they prepare them for the vestibular, but they also teach a course called Consciência y Cidadania Negra. So Black consciousness and citizenship. So again, this is about Black identity, about teaching, them to have pride in themselves as Black people, as Afro-Brazilian people. So these are just a few of the issues that people are dealing with as well. Thank you for that question. Yeah, you have one? Yeah. Okay.
I'm gonna say that this may be like a broad question, but in what ways has the pandemic and even I believe he's still in presidency, Bolsonaro, who's a very controversial figure, and anything that I've heard from him has been what sounds to me as anti-feminist and anti-everything. In what ways, can you provide a little bit more context in what ways have those things factored into the feminist movement?
Yeah, definitely. So, well, one thing that when I was reading about feminicide, the pandemic has exacerbated that problem because, some people say the most dangerous place for women can be in the home, in their own homes, right? That's where a lot of murders happen, especially when it's from a partner or an ex-partner. So, people being locked down and having to stay home, that increases that vulnerability. So that's one thing. But the impact of Bolsonaro, yeah, when I was there, I think 2019 and yeah, I think 2019 was one time that I was there after his election. And everybody, across the board was unhappy with that election and just saying how they basically called it a period of retroceso, of like, I can't remember what that translates to in English, but it's kind of like just going backwards, just all the advances. They felt like, with the Workers' Party being in power through Lula and Dilma, that was a more left progressive government. They were doing a lot of things to help people, poor people, to alleviate poverty, to make sure kids went to school, all these different things, right? And then with Temer and Bolsonaro, it's just going backwards, right? So instead of increasing access to higher education, also under Lula and Dilma, they did more things to, like they built universities in poor areas and majority Black areas to give people more access to higher education. These things were taken away. So they felt like there was a period of things being rolled back. Even at that meeting that I went to of the Foro Mariellis, there was, you could see the impact of budget cuts that had started coming down in the public university. So like the lights went out at a certain time and in the middle of the day, or they couldn't hold the event at, where they wanted to hold it because they weren't going to have access, because of those impact of the budget cuts and things like that. So also I have to read more about this, but there was this effort to change the retirement with Previdencia Social. It's like the Social Security benefits, and they were trying to roll that back. That's going to impact Black people, poor people more. you know, just, and you're right. I mean, Bolsonaro is very anti everything. Like he's against Black people. He's against land rights for Quilombo, you know, for people who live in Quilombos or the remnants of Quilombos. He's against indigenous people. He is against LGBT people. Like he just is kind of the extreme right. I mean, he even praised the person who tortured Dilma under the military dictatorship. He praised that person and lauded him as like a national hero, right? So he's just totally, I mean, some people call him the tropical Trump, or like just Trump times 10, right? So it's really a sad situation. And it's interesting too, because the Northeast has always been portrayed as like the more progressive leaning, like red state kind of, well, red means different there. Red represents the Workers' Party in Brazil. But yeah, so they say that if it was that Bahia could have, you know, saved the election or whatever, or if the nation had followed Bahia's example, it wouldn't have voted for Bolsonaro, you know? So there was definitely a lot of, or even there was an example of one Black feminist that I spoke to who, you know, a lot of her people who work in like public education or work for nonprofits and they're doing grants and projects, you know, they're dependent on funding from certain agencies. So this woman was doing, you know, various projects through her organization, Instituto Buzios, and the funding just like disappeared. So she was doing the work and not actually getting paid. So because of this shift in government and the political government, they just decided, oh, we're not gonna do this, or maybe I think she got paid eventually, but it took her like 6 months. So could you imagine like doing your job and doing your work for like, you know, 4 to 6 months and not receiving any money? So she had all these, you know, high hopes of, she was a single woman. She had been working hard all her life. She was saving up to buy her apartment. She had to put everything on hold because like she literally wasn't getting paid. So you know, even see the kind of trickle down effect in terms of people's, you know, livelihoods and you know, all of those things. So yeah, I think that's a one way I would answer that. Sure.
I'm wondering if anyone else has any other question. Fargo? Okay. My other question is, you know, being in the US and like reflecting back on your experiences in Brazil, and seeing these grassroots movements, are there any times where you're like, oh, the US can learn some lessons from this? Or like, what are the experiences that regarding like Black feminism that you're like, oh, we can learn, or I wish we would take some of these pieces from?
Yeah, definitely. That was really kind of my motivation for starting this project. Well, there's two motivations. That was one, and the other was just in general, like being having become fluent in Portuguese and Spanish, and you know, I can engage in, you know, reading literature by Black feminists from Latin America. And one thing that I noticed in Brazil was that the Black feminist scholars there, they know our literature. They can cite bell hooks, Pat Hill Collins, like they've read it, translated to English, or translated to Portuguese, or maybe they've even struggled to read it in English. So even if they're not fluent in English, they know our scholars, they know our literature. But how many of us can say the same, right? How many Americans can say, yeah, we know Black feminist scholars in Brazil? You know, so I really I felt kind of an obligation, since I do speak both languages, to kind of bring some of that into the US, you know. So in my book, I'm citing, you know, all these Black feminist scholars in Brazil, right? So I'm translating this work from Portuguese into English. And yeah, the other thing that inspired me to do this project was the more that I met people and talked to people and attended events, I was very inspired. And I felt like I wish that we did more of that here, right? In the US, I feel like Black feminism and feminist movements is still, in some ways, a very academic thing, right? It's something that you learn. Sometimes you have your feminist aha moment in college, like in your college classes, or, you know, with your peers and things like that. And I don't know to what extent we actually bring those conversations to communities, to, you know, your regular average, workers and things like that. Like at this march, there was another march, and in the book, I talk about how marches become this really powerful, a way that Black feminists use to express themselves and like really literally to occupy the streets. And it's a way to gain visibility and, around their struggles. But in 2019, there was a march in Bahia, a Black women's march in Bahia. And I remember, they had representatives from the Domestic Workers Union, which is, largely led by Black women, because Black women make up the majority of the domestic workers. They had capoeira groups, which is Afro-Brazilian martial arts. They had youth coming from school. So it's it's more kind of democratized, so they're bringing these conversations to communities. And they had an open mic. So they let, people were talking and people were sharing their concerns. And they had, Black trans women talking about their struggles of, not being able to, even if they get an education, sometimes it's hard to get jobs just because they're trans women, So I feel like there's a way in which it's the movement in Brazil is kind of bringing it to the masses in a way that I don't see happening as much in the States. I mean, maybe, again, I don't know the whole, I'm not familiar with everywhere in the United States, and maybe it is happening in certain places, but I just haven't seen it as much. So part of my motivation for doing this research and working on this book is that I do want to bring that, create this kind of transnational like sharing of information, but also maybe to inspire some things, in the US. Because I definitely do think we can learn a lot from Afro-Brazilian and Afro-Latin American women's movements more broadly. So I'm very much invested in, in helping those conversations happen.
A little bit.
Yeah. Any other questions?
This is part comment, part questions. So as we kick off this week for Women's History Month, you sort of kind of alluded to this in your last answer, but Black feminism in particular seems to still live on the periphery, if we will, when we think about a lot of times feminism, and especially in academia, and just some incredible works, right? We could just spend the next hour just naming names, from Toni Cade Bambara to Ellis Walker, and on and on and on and on. Why is the fight to center the lives, experiences, work of Black women such a fight and challenge? Not just in society, but in particularly here in academia, and in particularly as we talk about feminism, it seems like it's constantly a fight to include Black women and other women of color in that umbrella.
That's a really good question. But it's interesting because I think because of my location, it just comes natural to me, right? So I don't understand why it's a fight, because I'll give you an example. I'm at Spelman College, which is a historically Black college for women. So I'm in this like women's space, Black women's space. But not only that, when I was an undergraduate at New York University, I did a domestic exchange at Spelman College. So I actually attended for one semester. And so my first feminist theory class was with Beverly Guy-Sheftall, who's the director of the Women's Center at Spelman. She's a renowned Black feminist scholar. And so my first introduction to feminism in the academic sense was through Black feminism, right? And Beverly Guy-Sheftall also often says, she's originally from Tennessee. She says that her entry point to feminism was through Black feminism, through seeing her mother being very, having a lot of agency and autonomy over her life and making certain choices for herself and for her daughters. She often says that her mom fought the school system and didn't want her to take home ec. She wanted her to take typing because she knew that she wanted her daughter to pursue a certain trajectory, right, of going into, you know, college and academia, or not necessarily academia, but at least having a more intellectual trajectory and not just being, you know, doing home ec, right? So my entry point, my frame of reference has always been Black feminism, right? So whenever people say that, oh, feminism is for white women or Black women, you know, I'm like, where? Like, okay, like maybe to some people, but my, like, and reading Words of Fire by the anthology by Beverly Guy-Sheftall. That's one of the things we read in my first feminist theory class. It literally talks about the history of Black women in the United States being involved, you know, embracing feminism from like the 1800s. Mariah Stewart, Claudia Jones, who was a part of the Communist Party, you know, all of these people, right? So that was my entry point. So yeah, it's like when you ask me that question, why is it so hard to center Black women? I honestly don't know. I don't know why it's hard. It's not hard for me. It's not hard for the people that I'm around. So I don't know why the world outside the, you know, the spaces that I'm in has a hard time with that. I feel like we've been, you know, this has been going on for so long, right? Since the 60s, you know, Black women, and the US and Brazil have similar trajectories also, that Black women in the United States who were involved in the civil rights movement sometimes then formed a critique, right? And recognized the sexism within those movements. And then if they tried to get involved in the women's movement, they recognized the racism within the women's movement. Same thing in Brazil, right? There's a lot of Black women who were in the Movimento Negro Unificado, the Black movement. This particular organization of the Black movement was founded in the late 70s. A lot of Black women went into that movement, but they were struck by the sexism within that movement. When they tried to go to the Movimento de Mulheres, the women's movement, they were struck by the racism of the movement. So they ended up creating their own autonomous spaces in Black women's organizations from the 80s, you know, on until now. So I know that's kind of a non-answer to your question, but that's literally the best I do. I'm very curious about that too. I don't know why it's so hard for people to do that when people have been talking about it for decades.
So Brianna shared this in the chat. She said, great question, chat, and response. Feels like a similar experience to why it is so difficult to even discuss the experience of Black folks in higher ed and how much that is shaped by the history of the university. The experience centering struggles of women of color at UTEP was really different, but their history of a university is a bit less steeped in elite exclusion of anyone who wasn't an affluent white man than Lehigh.
Yeah, thank you for that comment.
Anybody else?
Can you talk a little bit about, because when we talk about feminism, it's oftentimes in the context of like, what are women doing, but how can men be more of an ally? And have you seen examples of in Brazil of how men were allies against particularly against violence against women?
That's a great question. You know, I always think about bell hooks and her very simple definition of feminism as, you know, wanting an end to sexism and sexist oppression, right? That always stuck with me. And, you know, the question of men, I don't see that as much in Brazil, in the movements and the, you know, the organizations that I've been, you know, familiar with and the people that I've been talking to. It's very much about autonomous space for Black women, right? I think people talk about like as mothers, like making sure you raise your sons in a particular way so that they won't accept violence against women, so they won't perpetrate it, you know, so that they'll know. So like kind of raising, you know, young men to kind of follow a certain trajectory or to have feminist principles. And so I think that's a way that they can become allies. I guess what I've seen in Brazil too is just, yeah, some male politicians or Black movement leaders, can perform allyship or be, like opening up spaces, giving resources, just supporting, Black women in what they're trying to do. So I think there does need to be more of that though, like more emphasis on that, because, we can never get rid of the problem of violence against women if men aren't involved in, if we don't transform people's consciousness and awareness and things like that. I know in the US context, there's an organization, there's several organizations about men against violence or men, I can't remember the particular name, but I think that there needs to be a lot that men need their own spaces to have these conversations as well, right? I think one thing that gets tiring is if women have to be the ones to always, to educate or to always, it's like, okay, we want to deal with our own things. We want to talk amongst each other. We want to have our own space. So we don't, they don't necessarily want to spend a lot of time like, doing that work. So I think it's very important that men have their own spaces to have those conversations as well, or to attend the events. Like Julio das Pretas, I think, is a perfect example of, just there's so many different events that are open to anyone, right? So if you want to learn about whatever these issues are, just attend an event and you can just listen and learn. You don't have to take up space and be, make it about you, but just being in that space, you can learn, learn how to become an ally. So I think that's one thing I would say as well. Thank you.
Thank you for
All
that.
right.
This was an amazing talk. Thank you so much.
Thank
The
you.
statistics are shocking, but I thank you for your work, and you can just see your passion in it, and you are phenomenal at what you do. So thank you for joining us here
Thank
today
you.
and your time here.
And thank you all for joining us as well. Please join us next week as we talk about maternal mental health with our CGE GA Fazia. So thank you all and see you next week. Bye.